Welcome back to our study of 2 Samuel. This is session 7, and we're going to be looking today at a fairly famous story from 2 Samuel chapters 11 and 12. It's often called the story of David and Bathsheba because those are two of the main characters, but I think it would be more appropriate to go ahead and call this what it is. This is a story of David's sin. And so what I'd like to do with this maybe familiar story is to make sure that we are aware enough of some of the details to see what's actually taking place and the way in which not only what happened is properly reported, but the way in which it's presented is understood so that we can really gain what we're designed to gain from this story. And so let's kind of talk it through by looking at the story. There's quite a few events actually within the story that itself isn't particularly long. It begins somewhat famously at the beginning of 2 Samuel chapter 11 with this kind of subtle but strong statement in the spring at the time when kings go off to war. David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem. And so this is setting the scene for us, and it is sort of the very first mini scene, if you will, is that Joab, the leader of the armies of Israel, is sent out by David the king at a time when the king himself would normally go out to war, and yet this particular time, David stays home. We're led to wonder, is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? Is this rest? Is this a problem? Where will we go next? And we don't have to wait very long to find out, because the next verse tells us that one evening David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of the palace. From the roof, he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful. It's actually from the Hebrew word good. She was very beautiful. She was very good in form, attractive, and David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, "She is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite." Then David sent messengers to get her. She came to him and he slept with her. Now she was purifying herself from her monthly uncleanness. Then she went back home. The woman conceived and sent word to David saying, I am pregnant. And so we've already got a story. We've got this scene where David is, up on the rooftop walking around or up on the palace, and he sees this woman on the rooftop. He sees something that he likes, and he goes and gets it, and he sleeps with her, and they conceive of a child. So David's got a problem because she's a married woman. And he sent this word to Joab, leader of the army, says, "Send me Uriah the Hittite." This would be her husband. And Joab sent him to David. When Uriah came to him, David asked him how Joab was, how the soldiers were, and how the war was going. Then David said to Uriah, "Go down to your house and wash your feet." So Uriah left the palace, and a gift from the king was sent after him. But Uriah slept at the entrance to the palace with all his master's servants and did not go down to his house. Why? Did he know something was up? Perhaps. We find out a little bit more about his thought process in the following conversation. David was told Uriah did not go home. So he asked Uriah, "Haven't you just come from a military campaign? Why didn't you go home?" Uriah said to David, "Well, the ark and Israel and Judah are staying in tents, and my commander Joab and the Lord's men are camped in the open country. How can I go to my house to eat and drink and make love to my wife? As surely as you live, I will not do such a thing." Kind of turns it back on David, says, "Are you serious? Of course I wouldn't do that kind of thing." Then David said to him, "Stay here one more day, and tomorrow I will send you back." So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day and next. At David's invitation, he ate and drank with him, and David made him drunk. But in the evening, Uriah went out to sleep on his mat among his master's servants. He did not go home. Some of you may know what comes next. In another tragic move, David tries to cover up his sin with more sin. He sends Uriah back to the front lines to Joab, and he sends him with a letter sealing his own fate. He put in the letter, "Put Uriah out in front where the fighting is fiercest, then withdraw from him so he will be struck down and die." So while Joab had the city under siege, he put Uriah at a place where he knew the strongest defenders were. When the men of the city came out and fought against Joab, some of the men in David's army fell. Moreover, Uriah the Hittite died. Joab sent David a full account of the battle. He instructed the messenger, "When you've finished giving the king this account of the battle, the king's anger may flare up." He says, if that happened, he may ask you, "Why did you get so close to the city to fight? Didn't you know they would shoot arrows down from the wall? Who killed Abimelech, son of Jerub-Besheth? Didn't a woman drop an upper millstone on him from the wall so that he died in Thebez? Why did you get so close to the wall?" If he asks you this, then say to him, "Moreover, your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead." The messenger set out, and when he arrived, he told David everything Joab had sent him to say. The messenger said to David, "The men overpowered us and came against us in the open, but we drove them back to the entrance of the city gate. The archers shot arrows at your servants from the wall, and some of the king's men died. Moreover, your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead." David told the messenger, "Say this to Joab, 'Don't let this upset you. The sword devours one as well as another. Press the attack against the city and destroy it.' Say this to encourage Joab." I'm not sure it gets more heartless than that. When Uriah's wife heard that her husband was dead, she mourned for him. And after the time of mourning was over, David had her brought to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. But the thing David had done displeased the Lord. And so you have a number of interesting situations here where Uriah dies, and then Bathsheba mourns, and then the son is born. We move forward to the next chapter, which is not so much further action, but more so what happens next. So essentially, the prophet Nathan comes to David because he's sent by the Lord. When he comes to him, he actually confronts him in a really, clever way. He tells him a story. He says, "There were two men in a certain town, one rich and the other poor. The rich man had a large number of sheep and cattle, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb that he had bought. He raised it, and it grew up with him and his children. It shared his food, drank from his cup, and even slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to him." It's almost silly in its exaggeration, but Nathan knows that David is in a place where he's so blind right now, he won't even catch it. Now a traveler came to the rich man, but the rich man refrained from taking one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare a meal for the traveler who had come to him. Instead, he took the ewe lamb that belonged to the poor man and prepared it for the one that had come to him. David burned with anger at this act of injustice, and he was angry against the man, and he said to Nathan, "As surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this must die. He must pay for that lamb 4 times over, because he did such a thing and had no pity." And then Nathan said to David in these famous words, "You are the man." This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. "I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you from the hand of Saul. I gave your master's house to you, and your master's wives into your arms. I gave you all Israel and Judah. And if all this had been too little, I would have given you even more. Why did you despise the word of the Lord by doing what is evil in his eyes? You struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword and took his wife to be your own. You killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Now, therefore, the sword will never depart from your house, because you despised me and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your own." He continues, this is what the Lord says, "Out of your own household I'm going to bring calamity on you. Before your very eyes I will take your wives and give them to one who is close to you, and he will sleep with your wives in broad daylight. You did it in secret, but I will do this thing in broad daylight before all Israel." And then David said to Nathan, "I have sinned against the Lord." Nathan replied, "Well, the Lord has taken away your sin. You're not going to die. But because by doing this you have shown utter contempt for the Lord, the son born to you will die." Over the next few days, the child became sick. He was ill. David pleaded with God. He fasted and he mourned. So after this confrontation from Nathan, David goes into this time of mourning before the son has even passed away. And he is really an absolute mess. Wouldn't even get up to eat. And after 7 days, verse 18, the child died. His attendants were actually afraid to say anything because they thought to themselves, if this is how he mourned before the child died, imagine how it will be once it's actually taken place. David noticed this, verse 19, that they were whispering among themselves, and he realized what had happened. "Is the child dead?" he asked. "Yes," they replied, "he's dead." Then he got up from the ground, washed, put on lotions, changed his clothes, went into the house of the Lord and worshipped. Then he went to his own house and requested food, and he ate. They asked him, "Why are you acting this way? While he was alive, you fasted and wept, but now that he's gone, you get up and eat?" He said, "Listen, while he was alive, I fasted and wept because I thought that I might be able to plead with the Lord, and the Lord would be gracious and let the child live. But now that he is dead, why should I go on fasting? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him, but he will not return to me." Then, verse 24, David had comforted his wife Bathsheba, and he went to her and made love to her, and she conceived and gave birth to a son, and they named him Solomon. The Lord loved him, and because the Lord loved him, he sent word through Nathan the prophet to name him Jedediah, which means one loved by the Lord. Meanwhile, Joab fought against Rabbah of the Ammonites and captured the royal citadel. Joab then sent messengers to David, saying, "I have fought against Rabbah and taken its water supply. Now muster the rest of the troops and besiege the city and captured it. Otherwise I will take the city, and it will be named after me." And so David, acting like a king, mustered the entire army and went to Rabbah and attacked and captured it. He took the crown from the king's head, and it was placed on his own. He weighed a talent of gold, and it was set with precious stones. He took a great quantity of plunder from the city, and brought out the people who were there, consigning them to labor with saws and iron picks and axes, and he made them work at brickmaking. David did this to all the Ammonite towns. Then he and his entire army returned to Jerusalem. This is the story that we're looking at today. And you can see that there's a certain parallelism to it. It begins with Joab out to war in Rabbah, David back at home. David commits this great sin and conceives a child with Bathsheba. Then to cover it up, he sees to it that Uriah, Bathsheba's husband, is put to death. Then Bathsheba mourns the death of her husband. Then Nathan comes and confronts David on what he's done, and he acknowledges. Then David mourns because part of the punishment for this was the death of this child. Then the son dies. Then David goes to Bathsheba, and she conceives again and gives birth to Solomon. And then the final scene is David himself coming to Rabbah to finish the war and then returning back home. This is a well-known story for obvious, if tragic, reasons. And I think part of what draws us to it is that there are many colorful characters here in this story. Of course, you've got Bathsheba, who is David's latest victim. And I want to be clear that while not everyone is a victim, she was. There is nothing in this story that indicates that she was putting herself out there, that she was making herself available, that she was involved in this sin in some way that makes her an equal partner. No, he was the king, and he took advantage of a young maiden who really had very little control in this cultural situation. But Bathsheba herself is, of course, a tragic figure that we rightly draw attention to in important ways. Uriah is a fascinating figure in his own right. Here's this Gentile. Make no mistake, he's called the Hittite, so that we draw attention to this fact. He is not a blood member of the people of Israel, and yet this Gentile convert actually manifests greater righteousness than the king himself, than David, this one who knows God and has supposedly followed him his whole life. You've, of course, got Nathan, the clever preacher, who, in really a demonstration of wit and brilliance, brings David to this point of recognizing his own sin by laying out a parable. And so you have these characters that draw our attention, not to mention Job and others, but really the point of focus is on David. It's on his sin. And this really is a central moment in David's life. This is the tragedy that will mark the rest of his days. In a certain way, we've noticed at times that David's life kind of parallels that of Israel as a whole. This will come out in some of the future sessions. But to the extent that David's life is being told in a way that parallels Israel, this is this golden calf incident. The people of Israel are delivered from bondage and they're brought into freedom and they're awaiting God's next word. And then they find this, metal calf that just happens to pop out of the fire, and they bow down and worship this thing as if it were Yahweh. It's their moment of rejecting the covenant God had made with them. And this, we almost hear echoes of that in the background as David is acting so foolishly and unrighteously, sinfully, stupidly in this particular sin. And there are a number of valuable lessons that we draw from this about sin. We see here that sin breeds more sin. I mean, you can kind of learn that by looking back and looking forward. The sin that David committed with Bathsheba isn't where the story actually begins. It begins with his failure to go out and be the proper king. And so this act of irresponsibility and what seems like a sense of laziness and not taking the call that God had placed on him puts him in a situation where he sins more. And of course, within the story, I don't even need to remind you of the ways in which sin breeds more sin. You just look at what actually happened next, particularly with respect to Uriah. We also learn from looking at this story that sin brings suffering. And this is something that we've, of course, seen before and we probably know instinctually. But what's important to see here, and it will continue to be borne out in 2 Samuel, and actually in 1 and 2 Kings to a great deal, is that our sin doesn't just bring suffering to us. Our sin actually brings suffering to others. This is about David's sin, and yet list the amount of people who have been wronged. Not only those who are named, but even the unnamed soldiers who lost their lives because of David's ploy to take out one soldier unjustly. We also see here that sin makes us stupid. I mean, it really is foolish, dumb, ignorant. I don't know, pick your synonym, to describe how dumb you got to be, David. And that's what God says, you have it all, and I'd give you more. How stupid can you get? And there's a sense in which this is something that we see throughout Scripture, that sin provides us with this illusion of control. Surely I'll be able to manage this. Surely I'll be able to take care of this. Surely I'll be able to cover this up. And I think Joab's message back to David is sort of hinted with clues from earlier parts of Israel's story that communicate to David, just so you know, I see right through this. Don't think that you're getting away with anything. And in a surprising way, Joab almost becomes a prophetic voice in David's experience here. And so this stupid idea that I can get away with it is shown here to be the lie that it is. I think additionally, when you notice the form of the sin here, we're going to see that sin follows a typical pattern, and this can be valuable for identifying sin's presence in our own lives. There is a sense in which David's sin sort of looks like Saul's sin, that as soon as Saul became king, he kind of let it get to his head, and he just sort of took whatever he wanted, and he ignored the commands of the Lord for the sake of whatever was expedient, whatever was convenient in the moment. But I think at a deeper level, some of the words that are used to describe David's sin with Bathsheba are designed to echo the sin of Adam back in the garden. Of course, together with Eve, and yet Adam was the one who was called in that situation, given the command by God and called to maintain faithfulness in his family. And I don't know if you remember the story, you probably do. There's this fruit. And do you remember what it says? That he saw the fruit and saw that it was good, that it was pleasing to the eye, and then he took the fruit. And here in this story, David sees Bathsheba and noticed that she is good in form, she's beautiful, and so he took her for his own. And so sin is fairly uncreative. We're just in those moments too dumb to see what's happening. And so I think that these are among the many things that we could draw from this particular text. But I do think that even apart from some of these important truths about sin, this passage is actually more focused still. That there is this sense in which we're noticing not only that David's sin is sort of reminds us of Saul's, but it's actually worse. I don't know that Saul ever did anything that was quite this bad. I mean, absolutely, I'm not minimizing his disobedience, but you think about the moment when he lost the kingdom. Samuel had told him, don't offer the sacrifice until I show up, and he offered it early. And this act of disobedience resulted in the kingdom being ripped out from him. Like, why? That's just, David does worse, and yet he's restored to the kingship? That doesn't make much sense. Of course, there are consequences, but they don't seem as drastic. Why? And no doubt some of it is absolutely God's grace. And no doubt there is little sense in which this text is presented to us with David as some sort of an example of how we should live. Hardly. This place, among others, shows us more than any place that David is not always a model for how to live. But I do think that there's actually something to see in this regard. And I think what to see in this regard is that what made David different, what set him apart, was how he responded when he was confronted with his sin. If you look at the story closely and you pay attention to the way it's laid out, some of you maybe even noticed that there is kind of a symmetry to it, where the beginning of the story corresponds to the end, and inside that you have the two conceptions, and inside that you have the two deaths, and inside that you have the mentions of mourning. And at the very centerpiece of this, you have Nathan's confrontation of David. The technical term for this literary device is called a chiasm, and sometimes people can find these things in the Bible where they're probably not. This one I find to be pretty convincing because of the parallel terms and the ways in which some of the details line up so perfectly. And I do think they line up perfectly because what we're supposed to see is that this is the scene from which we should draw this. And here you actually do have not just a comparison of David to some of the previous characters in the Bible story, but actually a contrast. And again, while I want to be very careful not to hold David up as some sort of a model, as if there's anything redeemable in what he did, there's not on human terms. But there's this sense in which when we compare the way he responded when he was called out, we notice something. Think way back to Adam. How did he respond when he was called out? Well, Adam blamed. That's what he did. He immediately turned it on the woman. And he subtly turned it on God. Well, it was this woman who you put here with me. That was his response when called for on his sin. When his son Cain was called on his sin, what did he do? He avoided the issue, tried to change the subject. Hey, where's your brother Abel? Am I my brother's keeper? Of course, the answer was, well, in this case, yes. But what is he doing? He's trying to change the subject so that you don't actually shine a spotlight on what it is that he's done. When you look at Noah, what did he do? Well, after the ark and all of the acts of righteousness and obedience, he finds himself drunk on this vine that has produced this wine. And then he's sort of in his shame and he's uncovered by his sons in some ways that is questionable, some of the details that are going down. But I want you to notice how he responded whenever they kind of caught him in his sin. He cursed them. And so you have these various types of response here. Of course, in the most recent example, you have Saul, who, what did he do? Well, first he lied about it. And then he went into attack mode. And I think it's easy to see that this is a foolish response when it's somebody else. But let's be honest. I don't really like any of these, and I don't want to find myself anywhere on the list. But when I'm confronted on sin, I don't know that I'm tempted to outright lie, but I'm tempted to bend the truth in such a way that I don't have to come to terms with the depth of what I've done, what I've wanted, what I've thought. And it is very easy to turn it back on somebody else, even if it's not in physical attack mode like Saul, to essentially say, no, let's go ahead and pay attention to the fault somewhere else. How many people have pounded the pulpit against somebody else's sin, all in part to cover up their own? And yet what do we see here when we look at David? How did he respond? Well, in a word, you know the word. He repented. What sets David apart is not that he always made the wise choices. I think the reason why David in the end wasn't totally cast out owes more than anything to God's grace. But I also think that what we see here is that God always knew David's heart. And what he saw, all other things included, was a person who, when confronted with his sin, he didn't blame, he didn't avoid, he didn't curse, he didn't lie or attack. He said, I'll quote it to you again, I have sinned against the Lord. Now, as always, if you look long enough at the story, you're going to see foreshadows of the gospel that you probably wouldn't see the first time you read through. Here we actually see it in the quietest character of all, maybe appropriately. This innocent son of David who dies the death deserved by another so that the other would continue to live. And yet then, of course, history repeats itself. This innocent son of David who quietly goes to the cross and dies the death we deserve so that we might be freed and not die that death. So again, David was terrible in this case, and I think that's part of the point. The gospel is not for people who are perfect or even people who are comparatively good. It's for the rest of us. It's for the me's and the you's in our very worst moments. The grace of God is real, and while David didn't get God's grace in the way that he wanted it, it is everywhere in this story. And I think what we need to see when we pay close attention to this story, among other things, is that you can hear about the grace of God without knowing the grace of God as an experienced reality that defines you. And I think what we see here is that whether you know the grace of God depends on how you respond when confronted with the reality of your sin. Not my sin, not their sin, not his sin or her sin, not even David's sin, terrible as it was. Your sin. That's what I see when I look at this story. And I'd love to tell you that from this point forward, the story is really positive. I'm going to be real with you. If you've read ahead, you know it's not. And honestly, a lot of the lessons that we're going to learn over these next few sessions are more lessons about sin and the way in which it works. And this is not necessarily going to be a particularly fun part of Scripture, but I do think it will be incredibly good if we want to be people who not only experience grace, but allow it to transform us. So in a weird way, I'm kind of excited to continue looking through some of these ugly stories with you. And until next time, remember the gospel, stay humble, repent when necessary, and get to work.